So it's all part of the same game. You know, the term cancel culture. So I think what's now going on is an attempt to cancel our common history as part of a strategy to aggressively contain the Russian Federation. No one even tried to follow those lofty ambitions at the foundation of OSCE, such as access to information, access to any information, both inside and outside the country. So we all have a common history, we have a common European duty, and a common European space from Ural throughout the Eurasian continent. But what we saw in the end, an attempt to draw Ukraine as far back from Russia as possible. And one of the first campaigns, the electoral campaigns in the early zeros, EU officials publicly interfered in the electoral campaigns and said Ukrainians must choose who they side with, Europe or Russia. They had this either-or approach as early as then. And then, when they saw that the situation was not in their favor, they acted in breach of the Ukrainian constitution to force the Supreme Court to arrange for a third stage of the electoral process, which was not planned for. So this anti-Russian approach had been formed for a long time. And in 2013, when Ukraine held talks with the European Union on its association agreement, we drew Ukraine's attention to the fact that it's discussing having zero tariffs with the European Union, but we also have zero tariffs with the CIS free trade zone. So we had an arrangement with the EU that was put in place during our accession to the WTO. So if we have zero tariffs on both sides of the situation, and our agreements with the EU will be under serious risks. So we proposed a very simple solution. We must hold three-side talks. But they said, it's not your business. We don't interfere in your trade with China. But the volume of Russian-Ukrainian trade was colossal at that time. It was 2013. And when President Yanukovych realized that he needs to find some sort of compromise to preserve the Russian market, because otherwise we'd have to protect ourselves against the zero tariffs from Europe. And he asked the European Union to postpone signing this agreement. It led to the Maidan. It led to people being brought out to the streets. And he just was trying to take care of the economic interests of his country. Those in the European Union who incited this process, they were only thinking about containing Russia. And as we know, the Maidan resulted in a violence, and then we had talks between France, Germany, and Poland to ensure security in Europe. And the next morning, there was a coup d'etat. And when we asked these European states, why did you fail to have your Ukrainian partners implement what you agreed on? Later, they referred to this coup d'etat as part of the democratic process. And in 2014, there was also a coup in Yemen when the president, Qadi, fled And the international community still deems him a president of Yemen, and they're still discussing his restoration as president. But with Ukraine, it's all different, because the president was not for Western partnerships. He was unwilling to become an obedient tool for the West. And the first demands of the putschists who took power was to ban the Russian language as a national language and to drive Russians out of Crimea. And they sent their troops to capture the house, to capture the administrative buildings. And when we talked with our Western colleagues and said that they allowed this bloody coup to happen in breach of all European values, they said, well, you annexed Crimea. So they just forget, they cancel everything that had happened before that moment. They cancel everything that throws a shadow on their intentions. So they throw out their agreements, they throw out the coup and the blood that resulted from it. And we had to take those steps with regard to Crimea because there was a direct threat to Russians' lives in Crimea. But what led to this referendum is something that does not interest them at all.
So just like today's events, they count them from February 24th, not from November, when the president put forward the initiative on European security, not in December when we submitted the draft agreements for the United States and NATO. They did not look at the meetings we had with the United States and NATO when they refused to put the guarantees, the legal obligations on security guarantees on paper, so that no country reinforces its security at the expense of others. They forgot all this, and they just focused on the fact that, and they've been talking about the fact that Russia had 100,000, 200,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, that there was more shelling. They started talking about Plan B, and as we now know, and we have the document to prove this, that there was a Plan B and that our fears were justified of a direct aggression and an attempt to invade Donbass with weapons in hands. So on February 24th, they're saying that Russia invaded. And this is the kind of narrative the West is famous for. So this is what the cancel culture is all about. They're canceling the episodes they do not like. As I've already said, that after the government coup, Dmitry Yarosh and other neo-Nazis said that Russians will never speak Ukrainian, think in Ukrainian, they will never follow Bandera, Shukhevich, or other historical leaders. So, and what we've been hearing, that this is not Ukraine, these are marginal forces, but let's remember what we heard in September of last year from the president of Ukraine. He was saying that there can be no oppression or oppressions against Russians because he is a Jew, because he speaks Russian, so there will be no problem with that. And but now there is this draft law on the Russian language, and we demand that it be eliminated. And if we're talking about the attitude of President Zelensky towards Russia in September of 2021, answering one of the questions, he said, "Here's my answer to you." First of all, he referred to people living in Donbass as species, saying that not all people are actually people. So by saying this, he joined the League of Arseny Yatsenyuk, who in 2014 who referred to these people as inhumans. So maybe this is a Freudian slip. So this was a prime minister at the time. Now we heard this from the president. This is what we have been hearing from them. And after that, President Zelensky said that if you think that you're Russian while living in Ukraine, but you still believe that you're Russian and you want to be Russian, just go to Russia. So how is this call different from Dmitry Yarish's statements for all Russians to go to Russia? No one is noticing this. Everyone is turning a blind eye to this, and it is obvious that the masks are down now, and it is not Ukraine that is being now exploited and used to humiliate and to eradicate everything Russian. The entire world, the entire West is at it. And if you have a Russian passport, if you go into a store and someone believes that you're Russian, look what happens. Just look at what's happening with our Paralympic athletes. This is what is happening with the Western civilization. How will they justify what they do in history? So the facts I've mentioned is just a small portion that of the events that preceded our decisions, and we took these decisions to save lives, to prevent the deployment of Ukraine of military infrastructure that would threaten us. This includes the fact that Ukraine must not become a NATO member. And so these are the requirements that we have put forward. And it is not true what Ukraine claims, that they don't have any such laws that are at odds with the European values. And Gergiev, Netrepko, they cannot tour European locations and venues. Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn are being excluded from school curricula. So this is what is going on. So this unprecedented step is a manifestation of anger. So anything works. If you're Russophobe, you can do anything. You can do anything you like. So over the past years, we saw this principle in what the Ukrainian government was doing, but now this Russophobic old permissiveness has covered the entire Western world. Sanctions existed all the time, as the president had said, but the current scale is astonishing. I never thought that the West can have such a rich imagination to imagine so many sanctions. What they want is to get rid of Russia as an obstacle toward their efforts to build a unipolar world. They're not targeting ordinary people, as they say. They're targeting the government, the regime, so that the leaders feel that what is happening to them is happening to them. So, but they claim that this is not about the ordinary people, and they in fact are talking about total economic war. But this is what Germany was saying in the beginning of the Second World War. They want to destroy the Russian economy, and they're saying so in public. So this is not about Ukraine. This is about a world order in which the United States want to dominate as the only sovereign. So the Monroe Doctrine is now becoming a global phenomenon. So no matter how you refer to it, this is the approach. They can call it different names in various regions, for example, the Indo-Pacific Partnership, but we stand for our strategic autonomy. We believe that the president of France must stand up for the autonomy of Europe, but all the others are no longer fighting, so probably they will adopt strategic documents. But what we see in practice is that Europe has lost its independence, and the fact that Germany has been protecting the Kiev regime, including its neo-Nazi elements, all this suggests quite a few serious considerations. Not so long ago, from a historical perspective, Germany was already in this position, and a lot of people in Germany understand this all too well. And in conclusion, I have to say that we have never turned our back to talks, regardless of all the perturbations. And when the Ukrainian leadership suggested talks during the military operation and the president issued instructions to launch these talks, these are quite challenging negotiations. The Ukrainian side expressed some understanding that they understand the need to agree on something, but they constantly reverse their positions as if their US colleagues are holding them by the hands. And the United States proceeds from the premise that they do not want this process to end quickly. They want to continue delivering weapons and arms to Ukraine. There are provocative statements to launch Soviet MiG bombers or Stingers, which is a major threat because afterwards these weapons will be across Europe. So they want to keep us in military action as long as possible, but we have the health, we have the experience, and we have the spirit, and we have the will to protect what we're now protecting and to ensure Russia's security, and even probably more importantly, to give life in dignity for those who want to live in Ukraine while believing to be Russian and adhering to the Russian culture, as was always the case in neighboring Slavic countries. I would like to end at that and to say, to present Russia as being isolated or seeking isolation. This is not true. We have a lot of friends, many friends. Just count the number of countries who imposed sanctions and the number of countries which did not do so, despite the immense pressure the United States is undertaking. We demanded China this and we demanded Turkey that. They are humiliating these countries. We have millennial history, so these are great civilizations, but this is how the United States is acting. So this is like cowboy style diplomacy. So the gold rush carries on. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much, Mr. Lavrov, for your very interesting and insightful remarks. So now let's move on to the Q&A. Mr. Lavrov, good morning. My question is on the negotiations with Ukraine. I'm from International Politics Department of MGIMO University. So do you think that the talks are an impasse? And will it be a new Hasavyurt agreements that will inevitably lead to new conflicts in the future? So you probably watched Solovyov's show, right? Well, you know, there are many people who would love to lead these negotiations into an impasse, just to show an image whereby Russia is marred in this process, and by dragging on with this process with the help of the United States, this is designed to dramatize these developments in order to enable Zelensky to talk to international parliaments around the world in military outfits with tears in his eyes, pleading with NATO for intervention. Our Polish colleagues said that there will be a NATO summit and they will decide on sending peacekeepers there. And this will be a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO armed forces.
And they said that it's something that should never happen. And the Polish representatives are well known for their non-standard moves, acting provocatively, which can really lead to big trouble. But when they have these peacekeepers in Western Ukraine, maybe they want to stay there in Lviv. Maybe it's their strategy. And the second goal, this provocation. And aside from peacekeeping forces, they started discussing other forces, like maybe it's not NATO, but maybe the Baltics can send their battalions to protect Ukraine. So we need to stay calm. We have made ourselves clear, we have made our approaches very clear. They're put down on paper, and the European leaders such as President Macron and Chancellor Scholz and the Prime Minister of Israel have been in contact with us. We're talking with India, but still the Western countries are trying to act as mediators. And we're not against that, but we have red lines, which we have spoken about for years. And now, simply talking is not enough, especially with the experience of the Minsk Accords, when everything had been agreed at the Security Council of the United Nations, but still the Kiev regime, encouraged by the normative format guarantors, France and Germany, managed to sabotage its promises and commitments. And this cancel culture was seen here as well. They said, we're ready to implement the accords, but first we need to settle on a border, and then we can talk about elections and constitution and so forth. But in the accords, the order is reverse. You should first talk, and then you can discuss boundaries. They said, we wanted 20,000 UN peacekeepers, just as Poland with its ambition to take this part of Ukraine. And still they're saying that they're for implementing the Minsk Accords. So they were a set of specific commitments. And even so, they managed to subvert this process. So these things that the president mentioned should be set in stone, and they should be made in such a way that nobody can breach these agreements. I'm in my fourth year at the MGIMO. My question is about the non-proliferation regime. There is an ineffectiveness on the part of the organizations tasked with enforcing this regime. We are seeing the development of biological weapons in the Ukraine, and we also see open statements by the Ukrainian side that they're aiming to create nuclear weapons and are acting in this direction. So what steps can be made so that these non-proliferation regimes work as intended? This is a good question. This is a problem that's going to get worse with every day. If we take nuclear non-proliferation, which everyone pretty much agrees about, we cannot have a review conference of the non-proliferation treaty, which is held every 5 years. Last year, or the year before that, we had to move the conference. We had to postpone it due to the pandemic. And these conferences need to take place in person, because everything, a lot depends on talks which are not conducted via video links. But now we have a different situation. We decided that the session must take place within a certain time frame, and in order to have a consensus, we asked the Americans to confirm that they will issue visas for all members of the Russian delegation sent to this event. They gave us a paper. It was a pretty cunning document, but we're now seeing whether it's something they are going to abide by. But I think they will try to find ways to subvert this as well, to find a pretext to deny visas. Negotiators are very professional, unlike many Western representatives who engage in demagoguery in such talks. We use facts. So now they are trying to make sure that our strongest experts do not get through. And as for demagoguery, coming back to chemical weapons, when we had found documents with signatures from United States officials, from the Pentagon, from the Threat Reduction Agency, which is managing biological research around the world. And they're denying everything instead of just going forward and explaining what is happening. It is instead of explaining what the American military was doing in Ukraine on multiple sites. And most concerning is the establishment of new laboratories and the existence of other laboratories around the CIS. We're now finalizing a memorandum of cooperation in biology so that everything is transparent, and we hope that we will see this through to completion like we did with our Tajik friends and with Armenia. We're now in a final stage as well. And the fact that the Pentagon took an interest in these issues in former Soviet laboratories and invested in creating a new facilities in CIS countries is something that needs to be looked into. And I hope that we will solve these issues with Kazakhstan and with CSTO as well. With Kazakhstan, we have an initiative to create an agency on biological security under the UN, which would help implement the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Russia has been working for decades, fighting actually, to create a verification mechanism under this convention. And the only country against such a mechanism is the United States, because the United States don't want to show anyone what they're doing. And in bilateral arrangements, they have leeway to hide things and to pursue their own interests and engage in programs, the risks of which are already being talked about in the open. Weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons. There was a body under the Chemical Weapons Convention from the very beginning, which worked as follows. Any country which suspected that chemical agents were used would have gone to the technical secretariat, which would then send their experts who would gather material, carry it in a very secure manner to a special laboratory that would confirm that this is or is not a prohibited agent. And this would be its function under the convention. But acting on rules instead of international law, the West utilized brazen tactics such as blackmail, exerting pressure to imbue this technical secretariat with a new function of establishing guilt of countries. It's something that is not in the convention. And if it is not in the convention, it should be approved by consensus in the form of an amendment, but no amendments were made. It was a simple vote where a minority was in favor of these new functions. And by using direct manipulation of the heads of the Secretariat, they created a so-called investigating framework, which is in direct breach of all the conventions applicable. And establishing guilt is the prerogative of the Security Council. So as you see, in all three areas of non-proliferation, there are some problems, and we're very concerned with that. And we call on countries to eliminate differences and to remove provisions in breach of international law from documents. But seeing as the West is so eager to push for some rules which only follow its own interests, and to force everyone else to follow these rules, the fair and nature of these documents should be disputed. Thank you. Mr. Lavrov, I'm also in my fourth year in the International Relations Department. Now, my question is about post-Soviet space, considering the escalation not only in Ukraine but also in other countries. What amendments should be made to the Russian strategy with regard to the post-Soviet space? Thank you. This is a good question. The answer should be long, because constant amendments should be made to these mechanisms. It's a living organism. Both OSCE and the CSTO And let's not forget the Russia-Belarus Union State, which has 28 union programs, which are now being translated into legal documents for direct action. So these sanctions introduced by the US and Europe, obeying US will, these sanctions are trying to dictate their will to Russia and to other states, saying that if you maintain relations which undermine the effect of these sanctions, you will regret that. And this brazen attitude of the Americans allows them to talk in this manner to our neighbors. And matters aside, they do have the capacity to influence logistical and supply chains. They're now trying to stifle sea transport. Poland is trying to promote such initiatives. And there are people, high-ranking officials, which are constantly working in this area. And what's happening is an attack on our interests, in breach of all the values that our liberals have been so eager about, be it freedom of choice and market economy, free trade and private property. They take all of that and put it down.
But they say that they will correct everything and we'll see. But I believe that we need to move in the opposite direction. We need to make sure that if one of our Western colleagues wakes up in a bad mood, never ever we face a situation when we lack some components, so that aircraft, when we need some components, when they take the airplanes, they prevent us from flying airplanes. This is a threat to the lives of our people. When the central bank reserves are being frozen, no one could expect this to happen, because this is like stealing. You remember the gold rush and how they do it. So let me reassure you, and the government is constantly working at this, and our efforts within the Eurasian Economic Union, within the CIS, we also have a free trade area, so we are working on these matters in all these formats, so that we continue moving in this direction and promoting integration in these frameworks. Silvanov Ivan, also fourth-year student, and my question is on Taiwan. President Biden recently signed the draft law which prevents showing Taiwan and the nearby islands as being Chinese territory, the territory of the People's Republic of China, which is at odds at what for China stands for. Could you comment on these developments and steps of this kind by the United States? I will not comment on this, on what President Biden is signing. All I can say is about the official statement after the conversation between President Biden and President Xi Jinping, and China emphasized that the United States must stick to the position that there is only one China, And it was said in the US statement that they reaffirmed their policy towards China along these lines. So you know all this, and there was much has been said recently about the fact that China could benefit from this situation to attack Taiwan. And is this serious, or someone in South Caucasus could use this to try and to promote their specific agenda? So this is a matter of speculation. This is what political analysts do. But what we do, the work we're doing, is something that has been long overdue, and that must bring clarity to the way we interact with other countries, with the outside world. And we need to get rid of any dependence from the West. Of course, we remain open to cooperation on an equal footing if this cooperation is mutually beneficial, but opening the door to them into sectors that are critical for our economy, for our security, for the well-being of our people, I think we have no right to do this. We have a lot of brain power in our country. We have all the necessary resources to be self-reliant and at the same time remain open to the outside world. Thank you. Mr. Lavrov, third-year student, International Relations Department. There are quite a few experts who have been talking about Russia's turn to the east in economic relations, specifically against the backdrop of the special military operation in Ukraine and the West willing to build a new Iron Curtain with Russia. So what are the countries with which Russia will focus in promoting its economic relations? So is there a future for China-Russia relations emerging as a military and a strategic alliance? Well, our country is in two continents, and it covers Eurasia, so there's two parts of the world, and Russia has a two-headed eagle as its symbol, and we remember the Crimean War and the history, and we look at the cartoons that were published in the newspapers in late 19th century in the context that we had at the time. And if I remember well, there was a British representative standing in front of a two-headed eagle, and the Brit uses its sword, a knightly sword, to cut off one of the heads. So this was a cartoon published in a newspaper. So, and it just shows the mood that was back then, and it may be relevant today. As for the countries that we can work with and our turn to the East, we have always said, and this is in our foreign policy concept, we are ready to work with anyone who is ready to work with us on an equal footing for the mutual benefit based on consensus and so on. And we had $430 billion trade in 2010, 2011, 2012. So these were record high numbers in our relations with Europe. But when Europe was humiliated by the Ukrainian radicals after the Maidan movement, when they just ignored the guarantees provided by Europe, and the neo-Nazis hijacked their agenda, and Europe understood that it was totally impotent, and they wanted to offset this humiliation by blaming everything on us. And they called the referendum in Crimea as an annexation, so they did not recognize that they were the ones who caused this. It was at that time that they stopped all the relations, the summits, the meetings between the government and the European Commissions that we used to hold twice a year. We had sectoral dialogues. We had 4 roadmaps we were working on to build 4 common spaces, and they stopped efforts to ease visa requirements between Russia and the EU. So when there is this balancing act, and when one of the foundations you're standing on is removed, of course, you tend to rely more on the other foundation, and we have record high numbers in terms of our trade with China. We also work with China as members of the Eurasian Economic Union, and we have this effort to align our integration processes with the Belt and Road Initiative. There is also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is also quite an important structure. We have the BRICS format and its new development bank, which has been quite proactive. And there is also the RIC, the Russia, India, China format, and it still exists. It pre-existed before BRICS, and we continue to meet in this format. So these 3 countries have geographical ties, and there are a lot in terms of infrastructure and transport projects, and we're working on them. But if you take Europe out of the equation, we will never close the door to working with Europe, but you have to understand what I said. We must make sure that we do not depend on just Europe. So we will become stronger thanks to Eurasian integration, to the SCO, to the BRICS, and using other mechanisms. And this will enable us to look at other projects that could be beneficial for us and on which we can work together. Thank you. Mr. Lavrov, 4th-year student, International Relations Department, and my question is on the United Nations. We have a crisis in international relations. Should UN remain a major platform for resolving these conflicts? And how about this talk of excluding Russia from the UN Security Council? So yes, this could be a subject of a thesis, of course. Of course, this is very important when we talk about bringing more democracy into international relations, into building a fair, multipolar world order. We are not suggesting to replace the United Nations with something else. We want to go back to the roots of this organization and to deliver on the principle of the sovereign equality of states. The United States has been trampling upon this principle, and we do understand that it's hard to be independent in certain situations, but the principle of sovereign equality must remain relevant, including providing facts to every United Nations member so that they can have their own opinion. And I have already said, I'm not even talking about smaller countries, but even in the relations with major powers, the United States are pressuring them, are threatening them to sever their economic ties just to make sure that they vote at the United Nations as the United States tells them. There was a vote at the UN General Assembly on Ukraine, and 145 countries voted on the resolution against Russia. More than 100 countries will never impose any sanctions on Russia, but they wanted to show that Russia is isolated. And I think what the United States is doing is not worthy of a major power. It is not worthy of a major power to use methods, these methods of this kind. And I have worked at the United Nations, and I have been there many times, and I've talked to my colleagues there, and I know for sure that quite often permanent representatives to the United Nations of one country or another, so they're being forced to vote in a certain way by reminding these people that they have children at American university, that they have money in American banks. So all methods are good for them to achieve their goals. They are destroying the United Nations by insisting on respecting the rules-based order instead of international law. And they build these rules, this rules-based order, as part of various calls or partnership, but there is international law, international humanitarian law, there is the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, but then they they create this partnership on humanitarian law, for example. There is the United Nations Human Rights Council, then there is the European Court of Human Rights. We're withdrawing from it, but still,
throughout the 10 years that the European Union has existed, we and all others are insisting that the European Union signed the European Convention on Human Rights as a union, and they decline. They say that individual countries signed this convention, but the European Union has higher human rights standards than the Council of Europe. So they're making up a rule again, and that they're not subject to the Strasbourg court, that they want to solve their problems themselves. So we need to go back to the UN Charter, which, among other things, has the provision that respect for the sovereignty of states and the right to self-determination is a part of the fundamental principles of international law. And since the United Nations was founded, there have been discussions on what is more important: territorial integrity, sovereignty, or the right of peoples to self-determination. And these talks went on for years, for decades. And then they culminated in the Declaration on the Principles of the Evolution of International Law for the Friendly Relations of States. And it's a very extensive document which includes a section on the interrelations between sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the right to self-determination. I think it's a very relevant document, especially in the context of the Ukrainian crisis and what we are now discussing, what our delegations are discussing. And it has a direct relevance for the question of what the fate of the Donbass and of Crimea should be. They're now trying to have a referendum, maybe trying to draw out this process somewhat. But it is said that everyone has to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a state which respects the right to self-determination and provides and represents all the people living in this territory. And what do we have? We have Kiev, which tries to include Kiev and Donbass in its territory. But what they have been doing is bombing the Donbass. They've been shelling the civilian population, forcing people to live in basements. So we need to stand for United Nations values. A lot of valuable experience has been acquired. We need to go back to that. Thank you. I'm in my second year in world politics. Talking about the UN, do you think it'll be possible to move the United Nations headquarters to a more neutral state from the United States, or maybe to a developing country, to draw the international community's attention to the problems of developing countries and to lower the political pressure on the organization? We need to work on that. We need to work on that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lavrov. This was a very interesting meeting, and we're very grateful to you for coming. We wish you lots of energy and the best of luck. Thank you.